Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, From R&D Investment to Externalization, Where is the Pharma Industry Maximizing Value? Today's webinar is being hosted by Informis Pharma Intelligence, and my name is Amanda Micklus. I am a Principal Analyst with Datamonitor Healthcare's Market Access and Trends team, where I primarily focus on monitoring and tracking corporate and commercial strategy trends in the pharmaceutical industry, especially in deal making. We're going to divide the webinar up into three main sections. First, starting with a look at R&D investment trends and comparing and contrasting R&D spending with that of prescription revenue across three major pharma peer set groups of companies that we track at Datamonitor Healthcare. And we'll also go over a couple of productivity and efficiency analyses that we've done. In the second section, we'll contrast that look at internal R&D with a look at externalization by focusing particularly on licensing trends within the Big Pharma peer set and looking at in-licensing and out-licensing, as well as 5 years worth of deals and various data cuts, including trends in volume, value, therapy area, and phase. And then in the third section, we'll bring those first two sections together and look at how those two different models, internal R&D and externalization, have translated or will translate into commercial revenues for these three groups of companies. The data and the trends supporting this webinar come from various Datamonitor Healthcare reports, and the underlying data are derived from our suite of intelligence products, including Biomed Tracker, MedTrack, Pharma Projects, Pharma Vitae Analytics, and Strategic Transactions, among others. I want to remind you that during the webinar, you may submit a question using the Ask a Question box that should be on the bottom of your screen. So we can start with the R&D investment trends, and just at a top level, I wanted to go over sort of a big picture view of our industry from the point of view of R&D. To create new commercial products requires substantial investment in research and development, and from that investment, we have seen progress. According to our Pharma Projects database, the volume of drug candidates in the biopharmaceutical pipeline has grown at a rate of 6% over the last 16 to 17 years. And in terms of looking at return on investment based on U.S. drug approvals, we have seen a high volume of FDA approvals over the last several years, including a record-breaking year in 2015 for both CDER and CBER approvals, and signs that 2017 will actually be a much stronger year for approvals than 2016 was. But against that positive backdrop is simply the fact that drug development costs a lot of money and takes a great deal of time. Based on the estimates from the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, it can take upwards of nearly 11 years, 10.6 years, to develop a drug from the time the drug is synthesized until it is approved at a cost of $2.6 billion. And compounding that is the fact that the success rates in the industry aren't great. Based on data from our Pharma Premia product, which is an analysis tool that looks at probability of technical success, the chances of a drug that's in phase 1 trials eventually getting approved in the U.S. is only 9.6%. And in terms of commercial risks to brands, generics still pose the biggest threat to brand sales of drugs in the United States. And moving forward, as more biosimilars come onto the U.S. market, biosimilars as well as generics will continue to erode brand sales, especially the brands that fall within the portfolios of the Big Pharma, Mid Pharma, and Japan Pharma peer sets, which are three groups of companies that we track internally at Datamonitor Healthcare based mainly on revenue size, and for the Japan Pharma peer set by geography. I want to note a couple of things about the companies and the data before I move ahead. Firstly, you can see how rapidly deal-making can change the players involved. For our purposes, for these figures, Actelion is still split out separately from Johnson & Johnson, and similarly, Shire is broken out separately from Baxter or Baxalta post-spinoff. Secondly, the data supporting a lot of these figures has been downloaded at previous points in time, and therefore, especially for forecasted figures, these are subject to change as models have changed over time. Across these three pharma peer sets, you can see that between 2006 and 2014, both prescription revenue and R&D spending increased at the exact same rate, a compound annual growth rate of 6%. And 2006 to 2014 is what we considered the historic period and how we split up this entire time period. But while prescription revenue is expected to continue to increase through the forecast period, which is what we considered 2015 to 2020, although at a slower rate of 2%, R&D spending is expected to slightly decline during this period at a rate of negative 0.4%. There is also expected to be a reduction in the proportion of prescription revenue that's attributed to R&D spending. It's a slight reduction from approximately an average of 19% during the historic period down to 18% in the forecast period. But it's still a reduction and is significant given that prescription revenue is expected to slightly increase over that period. Now, there could be many reasons for this decline in proportion, including less investment made by companies in R&D amid increasing cuts to R&D budgets. But again, it's important to remember that this reduction in proportion is only a 1% decrease, and similarly for the absolute R&D figures, those expenditures are only expected to decline at a rate of just under 1%. So essentially, pharmaceutical companies are having to do more research and development with slightly less money. And this is especially the case in early stage research. And we can see this a lot more clearly here in this figure, which shows the breakdown of the combined pipelines of those three pharma peer sets by phase at a point in time in 2011, so about 5 years ago, and a point in time in 2016. And you can see that across most of the phases, the volume activity has pretty much remained consistent. The only exception, noticeable exception, is phase 1, which in 2016 has a much higher volume of candidates in the pipeline than it did 5 years ago. So again, a lot more early stage research is being done. Now that we've looked at some of these top-level views of R&D investment trends, we can now take a turn toward looking at the individual peer sets. Unsurprisingly, the Big Pharma peer set outspends the other two peer sets about 7 times as much, and that has been the case during the historic period and is also expected to be the case in the forecast period. An average Big Pharma company also spends a lot more annually on research and development than a Japan Pharma or a Mid Pharma company, with an average Big Pharma company spending about $5 billion annually on R&D, compared with $1 to $2 billion for an average Japan Pharma or Mid Pharma company. If we now break these figures down into the individual peer sets, starting first the Big Pharma group, these 7 companies depicted here in this figure are those that trended above that annual $5 billion average for the entire peer set during this historic time period. And Roche was the biggest R&D spender within Big Pharma, with an average annual R&D spend of $9 billion. Like many other companies within the Big Pharma peer set, Roche has really evolved its R&D organization by adapting new business models. After Roche acquired full ownership of Genentech in 2009, it reorganized R&D with the goal of maintaining that innovative culture that had helped yield some of Genentech's most important oncology discoveries. And as a result, today, Roche's R&D organization remains largely decentralized, except for a centralized effort in oncology, which is the company's top therapy area, through its Cancer Immunotherapy Committee. These same 7 companies are also expected, on average, to spend the most within the Big Pharma peer set during the forecast period. And again, Roche is forecasted to be the biggest R&D spender in this group, with an average annual R&D spend of $11 billion. However, most companies within the Big Pharma peer set are expected to experience a decline in their R&D spending over this forecast period. And for the few that are expected to grow their R&D expenditures, the growth will be modest at just about 1%. Moving on to the mid-pharma peer set, notably for this group of companies, both prescription revenue and R&D spending has grown at much faster rates than the other 2 peer sets. And during the historic period, both of those metrics increased at double-digit growth. And while both R&D spending and prescription revenue are expected to slow down during the forecast period to 3%, they are both still positive and much higher than the other 2 pharma peer sets. If we now take a closer look at the individual companies that make up the mid-pharma peer set, there are a couple of standouts. Notably, Allergan stands out with a 29% growth in its R&D spending during the historic period. But this number is likely more of an anomaly, as Allergan has really transformed itself over the past several years through large acquisitions and reverse mergers. So this number is probably somewhat inflated as a result of the company's onboarding of several R&D organizations, as it has undergone that transformative deal making. Celgene, too, stands out within the mid-pharma peer set with a 27% growth in its R&D spending during the historic period and a projected 5% growth during the forecast period. Historically, Celgene has been focused on immunology and oncology through top-selling drugs such as Revlimid, Vidaza, and Pomalyst. And more recently, the company has stepped up efforts in immuno-oncology and has signed several billion-dollar deals with biotech companies such as Juno Therapeutics, Jounce Therapeutics, and Agios. And now taking a closer look at the Japan Pharma peer set, notably for this group of companies, prescription revenue and R&D spending grew tremendously during the earlier part of the historic period. And in fact, R&D spending actually grew at a faster rate than prescription revenue. Both of those metrics hit peaks and have been declining since. And during the forecast period, R&D spending is expected to decrease at a rate of 5%, which is the largest projected decline in R&D spending among the 3 pharma peer sets. And now if we take a closer look at the individual companies that make up the Japan Pharma peer set, Takeda was a strong driver behind that growth in R&D spending for the entire Japan Pharma peer set during the historic period, with a 12% growth in that company's R&D spending. Takeda has undergone a couple of major R&D reorganizations within the last 6 to 7 years, including one in 2011 under new leadership at that time that created smaller therapeutic-focused units that developed their own strategies and managed their own budgets. And through an even more recent reorganization that has occurred within the last several months, Takeda has shifted major R&D activities to the US and Japan and has also formed a joint venture with PRA, a contract research organization. It's also reaffirmed its focus on 4 main areas of oncology, gastroenterology, neurology, and vaccines. So we've just spent some time reviewing some of these R&D investment trends, and now we can take a look at how this has translated into commercial success for these companies. Something that's probably on the minds of many executives like you who work in the industry and analysts like me who cover the industry is R&D productivity. And the bottom line is that there really isn't a perfect way to measure R&D productivity. There are many ways to analyze it that have been and will continue to be put forward. And here we're going to go over a couple of different methods that we use to look at R&D productivity. And the first is using what we called new product launch success rates. And to do this, we looked at the average aggregated sales per drug based on a drug's sales performance over its first 7 years on the market to get an idea of how the drug performed or will perform commercially over time. For this data set, the drugs that were included were those launched by these 3 pharma peer sets in the U.S. between 2011 and 2015. So again, newer product launches. And based on the data collected, the Mid Pharma peer set outperformed the other 2 peer sets with an average aggregated sales of $6 billion per drug. And this was especially supported by products introduced by Gilead and Biogen. The second productivity measurement that we did was a return on investment index, or ROI index. And this brought in the element of R&D spending into the equation to come up with a proxy for effectiveness. And similar to the measurement of new product launches, with the ROI index, the Mid Pharma peer set outperformed the other 2 peer sets. Many companies within the Mid Pharma peer sets, on average, spend a lot less on R&D than companies in the other 2 peer sets. And compounding that, again, was the fact that the Mid Pharma peer set did include those multiple blockbuster launches. Following on this look at the ROI index at the peer set level, we can also take a look at it at the individual company level to see how companies match up against each other. And in this figure, both inputs into the ROI index are displayed with the average annual R&D spend on the x-axis and the average annual sales for all of the company's new product launches on the y-axis. Unsurprisingly, within the Mid Pharma peer set, Gilead and Biogen had the strongest ROI indexes. Again, for Gilead, this was due to Sovaldi and Harvoni, and for Biogen as a result of Tecfidera. Within the Big Pharma peer set, both Bristol Myers Squibb and Bayer had the highest ROI indexes. And for BMS, its index was heavily influenced by the strong projected sales for Opdivo, and for Bayer as a result of the sales for Xarelto. And within the Japan Pharma peer set, both Astellas and Takeda had the highest ROI indexes. And for Astellas, this was a result of the sales of Xtandi, heavily influenced by that product. And for Takeda, its ROI index was heavily influenced by the projected growth expected for Entyvio. I want to note, though, however, just because a company may have a lower ROI index does not necessarily mean that they are not performing well in terms of R&D productivity. Remember, again, that this particular analysis only took into account a company's newer product launches from 2011 to 2015. Many companies within the pharmaceutical industry are still reeling off of sales of mature products that are still very much commercially viable. We've just gone through a lot of data here, and now we can go over some of the key takeaways from this section on R&D trends. There's significant pressure on the industry to produce new and successful products, and while we have seen progress to that end in terms of the growth in the pipeline and return on investment based on U.S. drug approvals, there are still many challenges that face the industry, not least of which are the high cost of development and the high attrition rates. And in terms of commercial challenges, generics still pose a big threat to brands, and moving forward, biosimilars will as well. We've historically seen a big surge in R&D spending by these three pharma peer sets, but over the next several years, R&D spending is expected to slightly decrease. The Big Pharma peer set outspends the other two peer sets, but notably the Mid Pharma group is the only set of companies that is forecasted to have positive growth in its R&D spending through the forecast period. And we have seen signs of improved efficiency and return on investment from those mid-pharma companies in looking at new product launches, especially from companies such as Gilead and Biogen. Now, following on that review on internal R&D investment trends, we can take a look at the other side of the picture, which is externalization, by focusing particularly on licensing trends within the Big Pharma peer set. And the Big Pharma peer set is this group of companies leading in revenue. Externalization is a critical component for the Big Pharma business model and is an important growth strategy that greatly complements that investment that these companies are making in internal R&D. Over the next few slides, we're going to take a closer look at 5-year trends in licensing by this group of companies to see how Big Pharma is constantly augmenting its pipeline and portfolio through in-licensing, and conversely how this group of companies is monitoring its existing investments to look for opportunities to out-license. The data in this particular section comes from our MedTrack database with supporting information from strategic transactions. And we can start with a top-level look at Big Pharma alliance volume, and this includes both in-licensing and out-licensing, but strictly focuses on pharmaceutical deals. Over this 5-year time period, the volume of licensing agreements has grown at a rate of 12%. And particularly between 2012 and 15, the number of deals has grown steadily year over year, as has Big Pharma's representation in the entire biopharma deals market. But it's worth noting that Big Pharma actually doesn't do the majority of deals. On average, over this 5-year time period, Big Pharma only represented 19% of the deal volume annually. So you can glean from that the increased importance of other players in the deal-making market, companies such as those in the Mid Pharma or the Japan Pharma peer sets, for instance, smaller specialty pharmaceutical companies, as well as an increase in peer-to-peer deal-making done between biotech companies. 2016 ended up turning out fewer deals than 2015, but it's worth noting that the change in absolute figures between 2015 to 2016 was not that drastic, and 2016 still represented an increase over the 2012 to 14 time period, indicating that 2015 may have been somewhat of an outlier year. Now, the decrease in 2016 is slightly more prominent with deal value, though. And in this figure, deal value includes the total upfront, milestone, and any other fees that are publicly disclosed by these companies. Again, 2015 sticks out here as an outlier. And In 2015, there were well over a dozen partnerships that were valued, biobucks and all, $1 billion or more. And this had a strong influence on 2015 being an outlier, and 2015 also featured the most such billion-dollar agreements than any of these other years within the 5-year time period. What's really remarkable about this figure, though, is that in contrast to deal-making volume, where big pharma companies represent a minority, deal values are different. And big pharma companies are indeed the largest spenders on all biopharma deals. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that they are larger companies and they do have the financial resources to do these types of deals, and they're also more inclined to disclose these deal values. But it still shows the strong representation of this group. And over this 5-year time period, on average, big pharma represented 53% annually of the total biopharma deal-making value. So we've just gone through some top-level looks at big pharma licensing deal-making, and now we can take a closer look at the individual companies that make up the big pharma peer set. In breaking down the figures by whether or not the deals are in licensing, in which the big pharma company is taking in rights to another company's products, or big pharma is out-licensing its own products to a partner, you can see here that externalization is critical. In-licensing is critical, and for most of these companies, represents the majority of their deal-making activity. But out-licensing, too, is an important part of the deal-making mix. Over this 5-year time period, AstraZeneca was the most active big pharma deal maker. And AstraZeneca led in terms of not only in-licensing volume, but also out-licensing volume. And this has especially been evident within the last couple of years. In aggregating AstraZeneca's universe of just out-licensing deals, as well as the out-licensing deals for many of these other big pharma companies, only a small proportion of them are standard licensing agreements or divestments, while a larger share of them have become more collaborative in nature and involve deal structures such as co-development or co-promotion. And one key example for AstraZeneca is its partnership with Celgene for durvalumab, which is AstraZeneca's recently approved PD-L1 inhibitor in immuno-oncology. Celgene paid $450 million up front for rights to durvalumab, and the deal allows AstraZeneca to have more of a focus on this drug in solid tumors, while Celgene has more of a focus on developing it in hematological cancers, including the evaluation of combinations. Among big pharma deals where the phase of the in-licensed drug is known, big pharma companies do deals pretty well distributed across the drug development timeline, from preclinical through marketed products. But the largest concentration of big pharma deals are done at the earlier stages, and this makes sense given the high attrition rates and the need to fill pipelines. Over the 5-year period, the proportion of both preclinical and phase 1 deals has gradually been increasing. In looking at big pharma in licensing by therapy area and in aggregating the 5 years set of deals by therapy area, more than a third of them involved an oncology asset. And what's really remarkable is the magnitude compared with other therapy areas. For instance, the second leading therapy area on deals, which was endocrine, metabolic, and genetic disorders, only represented 11%, compared with 37% for oncology. AstraZeneca was the most active oncology deal maker during the 5-year time period, followed by Johnson & Johnson, Merck & Co., Bristol Myers Squibb, and Roche. Similarly, you can see how much more dollar value is attributed to oncology agreements, which over the 5-year time period totaled $56 billion, significantly more than any of these other therapy area classes. And it's a pretty overwhelming indication of the importance of oncology to Big Pharma and the efforts that these companies are making to improve over existing treatments and to advance the standard of care. Not very surprising is the fact that the development of immuno-oncology products is really driving a lot of this oncology deal making. And if we just segment out the immuno-oncology deal activity, and this next set of data includes both Big Pharma and the Mid Pharma peer sets. If we just segment out the immuno-oncology deal activity, over the past 5 years there has been tremendous growth in the volume of deals. And this really started to pick up in 2014, which also happened to be the year that the first PD-L1 inhibitors came to the market, Opdivo and Keytruda. Also of note are the deal values that we see in immuno-oncology, which actually represent more than half of the total oncology deal value by these two pharma peer sets. Over this 5-year time period, Merck & Co. signed the largest valued immuno-oncology deal with Adlinks, worth $7 billion for the development of bispecific and trispecific antibodies. Now, most of that $7 billion is tied to milestones that may or may not ever get met. And if you rank the immuno-oncology deals done by these two peer sets by upfront payment instead, the largest we've seen to date is the option-based CAR T therapy deal between Celgene and Juno, in which Celgene paid $1 billion up front. Most of that was through the purchase of Juno's stock. Many large pharmaceutical companies are involved in immuno-oncology deal-making, including those with products on the market as well as those that are still in the development stages. Over the 5-year time period, the most active immuno-oncology deal makers were Bristol Myers Squibb and Merck. And this is not very surprising given that these companies have been the most commercially successful thus far with their marketed immunotherapies, immune checkpoint inhibitors. Over the 5-year time period, a pretty overwhelming majority of immuno-oncology deals were signed for drugs in development for solid tumors, while just under a quarter of the deal volume were for products in development for hematological cancers. The leading indications on immuno-oncology deals are also not that surprising, given that these are the tumor types that have responded best to immunotherapies thus far and for which immunotherapies are on the market. Among the solid tumor deals, the top indications have been lung cancer and melanoma, and among the hematological cancer deals, the leading indications were myeloma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Immuno-oncology deals themselves are really being driven by the pursuit to find novel combinations that can address larger or unresponsive patient populations. And while a lot of progress has been made in combination therapy, including in the immune checkpoint inhibitor area with BMS's Opdivo and Yervoy approval, as well as in the IO chemotherapy area with the recent approval of Merck & Co.'s Keytruda with chemotherapy, it's still very early stages in the combination area of research, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about which combinations will work for which patients and for which tumor types. And if we segment out from the same data set just the volume of deals where a combination has been being tested, similarly, there has been tremendous growth in this deal-making area, and also picking up really in 2014. The PD-L1, PD-1 target was significantly more represented on immuno-oncology combination deals than any other immunotherapy target. And this is a clear indicator that companies are investing in this target as the primary backbone in combination therapy, although there are efforts within the industry to find those next generations of combination backbones that can address more patients and different types of tumors. So to close out this segment and go over some of the key takeaways on the Big Pharma licensing trends. Over the past 5 years, Big Pharma companies have amassed a significant number of deals, growing deal volume at 12%. Still, this group of companies only represents a minority in terms of the players involved and in terms of the deal volume done. In terms of the value put into partnerships, though, the opposite is very true, with the Big Pharma peer set indeed representing the largest spender on all biopharma deals. In breaking down Big Pharma deal making by in-licensing and out-licensing, we saw that in-licensing for most companies represents the majority of their deal activity, but out-licensing too is an important tool that Big Pharma companies are using, and many companies, rather than simply divesting products, have been signing out-licensing deals that are more collaborative in nature. During the 5-year time period, deals were pretty well distributed across the drug development timeline, but the largest proportion of deals are signed at the earlier stages. And this provides a way for Big Pharma companies to supply their pipelines as candidates move through what is a risky and challenging drug development process. And lastly, the pursuit or really mandate to move the needle forward in terms of oncology care has made oncology a top priority in deal making. And driving a lot of that activity is the development of immuno-oncology drugs, especially combination therapies. So we've just gone through some licensing trends by the Big Pharma peer set. However, across the other two peer sets, we expect that licensing volume for all three of those groups of companies will continue to increase. And this will have an impact on externalized revenue, which we're now going to go over in the next section on revenue externalization trends. Before we get into the revenue breakdown, though, we can take a quick look at the composition of the pipelines of these three pharma peer sets at a point in time in 2011, so again about 5 years ago, and a point in time in 2016. And there are a couple of things that I want to point out about this figure. And the first thing is that both 5 years ago and today, there is a higher volume of unpartnered candidates in the pipelines than there are partnered ones, indicating that solo drug development and internal R&D investment are still very much an important strategy. But I also want to point out that the volume of partnered drugs has grown at a faster rate over the past 5 years than the volume of unpartnered drugs. Over this 5-year time period, there was a 64% increase in the volume of partnered drugs compared with a smaller 48% increase in the volume of unpartnered products. And even further, in looking at the proportion of the pipeline that's attributed to partnered candidates, that proportion has actually increased over this 5-year time period, while the proportion of unpartnered candidates has decreased. If we take this figure and break it down into the individual pharma peer sets, the themes are fairly similar, with a higher volume of unpartnered candidates in the pipeline than partnered ones. But there were some differences among the three pharma peer sets in terms of the change in the proportion over this 5-year time period for partnered candidates. For instance, the Big Pharma peer set has seen more of a significant increase in its share of partnered candidates. And this makes sense given the growth that we've seen with Big Pharma licensing deal making. There were slightly different dynamics between the Mid Pharma and the Japan Pharma peer sets, which have focused more on building their internal pipelines. For instance, the Mid Pharma peer set has not seen as much of a shift toward partnered candidates, and in fact, its proportion has slightly decreased over this 5-year time period. The Japan Pharma peer set has seen more of a significant decrease in its proportion of partnered candidates, and this may be a result of top Japanese companies deciding to retain rights to their products not only in Japan, but also in other major geographic markets where they may have partnered in the past, but now have the sales and marketing infrastructure to do it themselves. So with that pipeline context as a backdrop, we can now move toward looking at the revenue trends and seeing the differences in how internal versus external drugs have translated into revenue. This slide here provides descriptions on how we break out the drugs in the revenue figures. For instance, whether the drugs were developed via internal R&D or via one of these external methods. And I wanted to provide these definitions as we talk through the next few slides. First, this shows historically from 2005 out through 2024 the combined revenue of the 3 pharma peer sets by revenue type. And there are a couple of things that I want to point out about this figure. Firstly is that revenue derived from internally developed drugs has represented the majority of overall revenue, and that is the case during the historic period, how we broke this out between 2015 and 2014, and also through the 2015 to 2024 forecast period. So internally developed drug revenue continues to represent the majority. There's also been tremendous growth in externalized revenue, especially during the historic period. So while the proportion of internally derived drug revenue will represent the majority, that majority is expected to slightly shrink from 54% during the historic period to 51% in the forecast period, while the proportion of externalized revenue is expected to slightly increase from 46 to 49%. Now, this tremendous growth that we've seen in externalized revenue can be seen a lot more clearly here in this figure, that the growth in externalized revenue has actually been more than twice that as that of internally developed drug revenue. You can also see here how revenue in general is expected to slow down for both of those metrics during the forecast period. If we take this figure and break it down into the individual revenue types, there are a couple of standouts. Products that have come in through M&A or mergers and acquisitions, the sales of those products have represented the strongest growth drivers of externalized revenue during the historic period. And this group of products includes billion-dollar drugs such as Humira and Avastin, for instance. Also driving externalized revenue are co-developed drugs as well as acquired products or single product acquisitions as opposed to M&As, which are full company acquisitions. And during the forecast period, co-developed and acquired products will continue to be the strongest drivers of externalized growth. But the M&A products group is expected to slow down significantly in revenue during the forecast period, and this is a result of the anticipated generic and biosimilar competition that is expected to impact a lot of these key blockbuster drugs that companies have gotten through M&A. If we now single out the Big Pharma peer set, and look at it on an individual company level basis, for some companies there is expected to be a shift in the balance from mainly revenue from internally sourced drugs to externalized revenue, or vice versa, from the historic to the forecast period. Bristol Myers Squibb and Pfizer, for instance, are expected to see the largest decrease in their proportion of externalized revenue from the historic to the forecast period. And for these two companies, this is a result of generic competition that has affected their key drugs that they have gotten through M&A or key drugs that they have co-developed. For instance, for Bristol Myers Squibb, the genericization of Plavix has decreased its proportion of externalized revenue, which Plavix was the subject of a co-development deal with Sanofi. And for Pfizer, the genericization of Lipitor, which Pfizer got when it bought Warner Lambert, has also affected its externalized revenue. On the flip side, Novartis is expected to see the largest increase in its proportion of externalized revenue from the historic to the forecast period, more than doubling its proportion from 20% to 43%. And this is a result of the strong growth expected in the portfolio of products that Novartis got when it bought Alcon, as well as strong growth expected in some of its key co-developed products. And taking a closer look at the Mid Pharma peer set, about half of the companies in this group are expected to see a decline in their proportion of externalized revenue. And notably, Actelion stands out here. Virtually all of Actelion's revenue during the historic period came from externalized sourced drugs. But that is dramatically expected to shift during the forecast period as its internally developed drug, Opsumit, for pulmonary arterial hypertension gains momentum and is expected to have strong sales. In fact, Actelion's entire PAH portfolio is really what attracted so many bidders to try to buy the company at the end of last year, with, of course, Johnson & Johnson ending up acquiring Actelion for $30 billion at the beginning of this year. Unlike Actelion, companies such as Shire and Lundbeck are forecasted to grow their proportion of externalized revenue. And for Shire, this is the result of some key drugs that it has gained in acquisitions, for instance, of New River Pharmaceuticals and Transkaryotic Therapies. And for Lundbeck, this is a result of the growth expected in some of its co-developed products, including products that it is working on under its CNS alliance with Otsuka. For the Japan Pharma peer set, the majority of companies in this group are expected to see an increase in their proportion of externalized revenue. And Takeda is expected to see the largest jump with its proportion of externalized revenue increasing to nearly half of its total revenue. And a couple of factors have influenced this change. Takeda's sales from internally developed drugs began declining when Actos generics came onto the market, its diabetes products, starting in around 2011. But around the same time, the company's sales from products acquired through M&A really began to take off, notably Velcade, which came from the Millennium acquisition. Now that we've reviewed some externalization trends at the combined peer set level and then at the individual peer set and company levels, we can now take a turn toward looking at these same figures at the individual drug level. And this figure shows the average per drug revenue over 3 5-year time periods, split out by the average per drug revenue for drugs developed via internal R&D compared with those developed via an externalized method. The shifts we're expecting to see toward revenue of certain external types indicates a heavier reliance on collaboration partners in acquisition activity. And based on the data at the average per drug level, we can see that this changeover has been somewhat validated in that the average per drug revenue for products, externalized products, is significantly higher, more than twice that as those from internal R&D engines. And at the peer set level, big pharma companies tend to have higher average per drug revenues than mid pharma and Japan pharma companies. And that's true for both external products and internally sourced drugs. The mid pharma group's averages per external drug are the next highest, followed by the Japan pharma peer set. And for the average per drug revenue from internal R&D, the gap is expected to widen slightly more between mid pharma and Japan pharma companies during the 2020 to 2024 forecast period, with the mid pharma averages increasing as a result of strong forecasted sales from products such as Celgene's Otezla and Gilead's Genvoya. Okay, so to sum up this section and go over some of the key takeaways on revenue externalization trends, we saw that while unpartnered products in the pipelines of these three pharma peer sets will continue to outnumber the partnered ones and show that solo drug development and internal R&D is still very much an important activity, over the past 5 years, there has been a larger increase in the volume of unpartnered candidates. Further, the proportion of revenue derived from externalized methods is expected to slightly increase between the historic and the forecast period, while the proportion of internally derived drug revenue, while still remaining the majority of total revenue, is forecasted to decrease. Much of the growth that we have seen in externalized revenue, especially during the historic period, has come from products acquired or products that have come in through M&A deals. And in the forecast period, products that are co-developed or acquired as single product acquisitions will remain the strongest growth drivers. Many of the pharma companies across the three pharma peer sets, such as Novartis, Shire, and Takeda, are expected to see an increase in their proportion of externalized revenue. And externally sourced drugs have, on average, are expected to perform better commercially with twice as much in average per drug sales than internally developed drugs. So by way of just some final thoughts on these three sections, we've gone through sort of the starting point of the drug development process. First, looking at internal R&D investment trends, and then complementing that with a review on externalization by focusing particularly on licensing trends within the big pharma peer set. And then in the third section, we brought those two together, those two different models together, to compare and contrast how internal R&D and external R&D have translated or will translate into commercial revenues. There is pressure from all sides: public pressure, political pressure, patient pressure, and even pressure within the industry to do better for the money invested in research and development. And those critical eyes will, as a result, be even more mindful of the money invested in R&D and the products and the prices that come as a result. For that reason, pharma companies are going to continue to do licensing deals as a way to not only access novel drugs, technologies, and capabilities of partners, but to also balance out that risk that they are taking with internal research and development. And further, I think that the trend of pharma companies relying more and more on these externalized products for their revenue will continue to increase. So that brings a close to the webinar slides, and I have a few minutes left, so I'm just going to take a look at the questions and see if I can just answer one question before we close out the session. Let me just pause for a second. Okay, one question coming in is, you pointed out just actually in the last couple of slides that externalized revenue at the drug level is higher than internally developed revenue, and why do you think that is? This is something that I thought about when I was putting together this report, and actually when I was getting the slides together, and I don't think it's really a fair assessment to say that drugs developed externally will always be more successful and always generate more revenue. I don't think you can make a blanket statement like that, but I think what's happened in a lot of the cases, and especially with this particular data set, is that especially for drugs that have come in through M&A, again, M&A was that strongest driver of externalized revenue, especially for drugs that came in through M&A, a lot of them were acquired at a later stage. And so that the acquiring companies, these bigger pharmaceutical companies, were really able to take advantage of that and instead focus on either later stage development or commercialization planning, where these bigger companies tend to excel and have a lot more expertise than smaller companies, rather than putting in the efforts into early stage development. And one analysis that I think would be interesting to do to sort of prove that out is to take that data set of just the average revenue per drug for just the external products data set and break that down even further into the phase of the drug for the M&A group at the time that the owner company was acquired, under the thinking that maybe we would see higher average per drug revenue for those drugs acquired at a later stage than those developed at an earlier stage. Okay, I think I don't really have enough time for any other questions, so I am just going to wrap up the webinar. I want to thank you for joining me today. If you have any further questions, you can send an email to the address on the screen, which is pharma@informa.com. A recording of this webinar should be available to all of the registrants. And I want to thank you again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.